In the dry, shimmering heat of the Las Vegas desert, an eerie stillness clings to the sprawling estate once owned by Howard Hughes. The reclusive billionaire, aviation pioneer, and eccentric film director had turned the Hacienda into his sanctuary, sealing himself off from the world in a cocoon of secrecy. The house was his fortress, a place where his genius and paranoia collided in equal measure. Yet, even in death, it seems Hughes never truly left. The stories began not long after Hughes passed away in 1976. Staff members hired to maintain the property spoke of a chilling presence that roamed the halls. Late at night, the faint scent of cigar smoke would drift through rooms that had been sealed for years. An old gramophone in the study, the same one Hughes was known to listen to obsessively, would inexplicably start playing scratchy tunes from the 1930s. The staff tried to dismiss it, but the unease was palpable. One evening, a caretaker named Marjorie was working late, dusting the long-forgotten artifacts in Hughes' private study. The room was dimly lit, its heavy drapes drawn tight against the desert sun. As she moved to wipe a framed blueprint for one of his aircraft designs, she felt the hairs on her neck rise. She turned, expecting to find someone standing there. Instead, she was greeted by the faint outline of a man, tall, gaunt, with piercing eyes that seemed to glow faintly in the dark. It was unmistakable, Howard Hughes. Marjorie froze. The apparition didn't move but seemed to regard her with an intensity that pinned her to the spot. Then, as suddenly as it had appeared, it dissolved into the shadows. She fled the house, vowing never to return. But her story was just the beginning. Over the years, countless visitors reported seeing Hughes' silhouette in the windows, pacing as if deep in thought. Some said they could hear the faint sound of his typewriter echoing from the study, even though the machine had been removed decades earlier. Others spoke of the distinct metallic clink of tools coming from the garage, where Hughes had once tinkered endlessly with his inventions. The strangest account came from a group of paranormal investigators who stayed overnight in the Hacienda. Equipped with state-of-the-art equipment, they hoped to debunk the tales. Instead, they captured chilling evidence. A thermal image of a figure seated at Hughes' favorite chair, and an EVP recording in which a deep, raspy voice muttered, "Mine. It's all mine." One investigator, a skeptic named Daniel, experienced something he could never explain. While alone in the study, he heard a faint whisper, "Why are you here?" The voice was unmistakably male, clipped and authoritative, like Hughes himself. Moments later, the heavy oak door slammed shut, trapping him inside. By the time the rest of the team pried the door open, Daniel was sitting in the corner, pale and trembling, unable to recount what he'd seen. Locals say the house remains cursed. Realtors who attempt to sell the property report that buyers are driven away by unexplained accidents and oppressive feelings of dread. Even the most pragmatic skeptics admit there's something off about the place, as if Hughes' obsessive need for control extends beyond the grave. Many believe that Howard Hughes' spirit lingers, unable to part with the treasures and memories he hoarded in life. Perhaps his paranoia binds him to the house, compelling him to guard what he built against unseen threats. Or maybe, in death, Hughes has become a prisoner of his own, making a restless ghost haunted by the very solitude he sought. The Hacienda stands silent now, shrouded in mystery, its once vibrant halls now shadows of their former selves. But if you listen closely, they say, you can still hear the echo of Hughes' footsteps pacing through the night, forever tethered to the empire he could never truly leave behind. As the years passed, the stories of Hughes' haunting only grew more unsettling, each new account adding another layer to the mystery of his posthumous existence. It wasn't just the strange noises, the ghostly silhouette in the window, or the faint scent of cigar smoke that lingered long after the last guest had left. The house itself seemed to bend and twist in unnatural ways, as if the walls and floorboards were alive with the same restless energy that had driven Hughes in life. One evening, a couple who had rented the property for a weekend getaway found themselves caught in a storm, unable to leave the house as rain pelted the windows and thunder cracked across the sky. They took refuge in the main living room, sitting before the fire as they waited for the weather to clear. As the night wore on, they began to feel an oppressive weight in the air. It was as if the very atmosphere around them thickened, pressing in from all sides. Suddenly, the power went out. The house was plunged into darkness, save for the flickering glow of the fire. The woman, Laura, went to grab a flashlight from the kitchen, but as she passed through the hallway, something caught her eye. A shadow, faint but unmistakable, flitted across the far end of the corridor. At first, she thought it was the wind, but the windows were tightly sealed. There was no breeze. "David," she called, her voice trembling. No response. Laura's heart raced as she hurried back to the living room. But when she opened the door, she froze. Her husband, David, was standing by the window, staring out into the stormy night, but it wasn't David anymore. The figure in front of her was a tall man, older, with wild, disheveled hair and a haggard look in his eyes. His face was gaunt, and his clothes were mismatched, as if he'd been wearing them for days, weeks even. It was him, Howard Hughes. The figure didn't move, didn't acknowledge her presence. It simply stared into the storm with an intensity that sent chills down her spine. She wanted to scream, to run, but her legs wouldn't obey. Time seemed to stretch and warp around her as she stood there, paralyzed by the haunting vision. When she finally blinked, the figure was gone. David, her husband, was back in his original position, staring out the window in a daze. He looked at her, confused, as if nothing had happened. "Laura? What's wrong?" he asked, his voice distant and unfocused. She wanted to tell him what she had seen, but the words wouldn't come. There was something about the way he looked at her that made her hesitate, something in his eyes that wasn't quite right. For the rest of the night, Laura couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching her, that something was waiting. The next day, when the storm cleared and they left the house, they found an old photograph on the doorstep. It was a picture of Hughes himself, taken years ago when he was still in the prime of his life. But as they looked closer, they noticed something even more disturbing. In the background, in the dimly lit corner of the frame, was the faint outline of a figure, a shadowy figure, lurking just outside the frame, barely visible. It was impossible to tell who it was, but there was something undeniably unsettling about the way it seemed to be watching Hughes. But that wasn't the only strange occurrence. The following week, a local historian named Thomas, who had long been fascinated by the legend of Howard Hughes' Hacienda, decided to do some research. He'd heard the rumors, of course the sightings, the strange noises, but he wanted to know more. Armed with a camera and an audio recorder, he visited the house one quiet evening, hoping to capture some evidence of the paranormal. As he walked through the halls, his flashlight flickering, he couldn't shake the feeling that he was being watched. Thomas entered the study, the room where many believed Hughes had spent his final, tortured years. He set up his equipment and began to explore, noting the worn bookshelves, the scattered papers, the odd sense of stillness that hung in the air. But as he inspected a stack of old documents on the desk, a loud bang echoed from somewhere deep within the house, so sudden, so forceful that it made him jump. His heart raced as he turned toward the sound. It was coming from the basement. Thomas hesitated. The idea of descending into the darkness of that underground space, so long abandoned, sent a wave of dread through him. But he couldn't resist. He made his way down the creaky staircase, his flashlight barely cutting through the thick blackness. At the bottom, he found what looked like an old storage room filled with crates and boxes covered in dust. But something was different here. In the far corner, there was a large, ornate mirror, its surface cracked and warped, as if it had been shattered long ago and hastily repaired. Thomas approached it, his curiosity piqued. As he looked into the cracked mirror, something moved behind him, just a flicker, a glimpse. He spun around, but no one was there. Only the empty, oppressive silence of the room. But when he looked back at the mirror, his heart stopped. The reflection staring back at him was not his own. It was Hughes. The figure in the mirror wore the same expression as in the photo, a mixture of fear and frustration. But the thing that truly unsettled Thomas was the look in Hughes' eyes. They were filled with a haunting desperation, as if pleading for something, or warning him of something about to happen. Before Thomas could react, the mirror seemed to warp and twist, its surface rippling like water. The room around him grew colder, and the air felt thick, suffocating. The oppressive presence that had lingered throughout the house now felt as if it had taken physical form, surrounding him, choking him with its intensity. The mirror shattered with a deafening crash, and Thomas stumbled backward, heart pounding. The air cleared in an instant, the room returning to its usual quiet state. But when he looked at his hands, they were trembling. His recorder, which had been running this entire time, was still playing. The static crackling was loud in his ears, and when he rewound it, he heard something that made his blood run cold. A voice, low, gravelly, and unmistakable. "You shouldn't have come here." Now Thomas, like all the others before him, was trapped in the mystery of Howard Hughes' Hacienda, unable to escape the man who would never leave. Don't forget to subscribe and like if you liked this story. As the weeks passed, the unease surrounding the Hacienda only deepened. The stories were becoming more than just whispers, more than just rumors. They were creeping into the very fabric of Las Vegas, poisoning the minds of those who dared to speak about the house. But the most disturbing of all the tales was that of Thomas the historian, who had disappeared without a trace after his visit. Days after his last recorded entry, his colleagues and friends began receiving strange messages. Texts that came from Thomas's phone messages sent in the middle of the night, with just a series of incoherent words, strange symbols, and a single phrase, "It's not over. He's still here." When they attempted to trace the location of the texts, they led them back to the hacienda itself, each one pointing to different rooms, different parts of the house, as if Thomas were still moving through its haunted halls, lost, trying to find something or to escape something that he could not outrun. But no one dared to go after him. The locals had long whispered that the hacienda was more than just a haunted house, it was a prison. A place where those who ventured too deep into its mysteries were never meant to return. Even the bravest souls, those who ventured into the house's cavernous interior for research or thrill-seeking, left with haunted eyes and broken spirits. Some even disappeared without a trace, their names lost to time, as if the house itself was erasing them from existence. It wasn't until a renowned paranormal team, led by a woman named Evelyn, decided to investigate that the true nature of the haunting began to reveal itself. Evelyn had studied the occult and paranormal phenomena for years, building a reputation for solving some of the most mysterious and dangerous hauntings in the world. Her team had worked on cases involving demons, poltergeists, and cursed locations, but the hacienda was different. There was something more ancient, more sinister about the place. When Evelyn and her team arrived at the hacienda, they were greeted by the house's cold, oppressive atmosphere. The air inside felt thick, almost impossible to breathe, and every step echoed as though the house itself were listening, watching. They set up their equipment, cameras, EMF detectors, thermal imaging, and began their investigation, expecting to capture evidence of the haunting. But what they found was far beyond what they could have ever prepared for. It started with the smell, sharp and pungent, the unmistakable odor of oil and machinery, mixed with the faint scent of tobacco. As Evelyn walked through the halls, she could hear the faint whirring of a machine, like a plane's engine starting up, distant but undeniable. She recognized it immediately. It was the sound of Hughes' aircrafts, the engines that had powered his designs, the very creations that had driven him to obsession. Her team followed her deeper into the house, drawn to a room at the back, the old workshop where Hughes had once spent hours perfecting his aircraft designs. It was as if the room had been preserved in time, untouched for decades. The tables were cluttered with blueprints, mechanical parts, and odd tools scattered haphazardly across the floor. But there was one thing that caught Evelyn's eye: the large model of an aircraft, perched atop a table in the center of the room. It was a replica of the infamous Hercules, Hughes' legendary flying boat. Evelyn knew the story, how Hughes had poured his heart, soul, and fortune into building the aircraft, only for it to fail miserably in his eyes. He had never flown it, never seen it take to the skies as he had dreamed. The aircraft became a symbol of his obsessions and failures, a dream unfulfilled. Yet here it was, in perfect condition, as though Hughes had only just finished working on it. When Evelyn moved closer to examine the model, she felt a strange sensation wash over her, a sudden wave of dizziness. The lights flickered, and the temperature in the room plummeted. The team watched as Evelyn reached out to touch the aircraft, her hand trembling as she made contact with its surface. That's when it happened. The ground beneath them seemed to shift, as if the house itself were alive. The walls groaned and creaked, and the sound of an engine roaring to life filled the air. But there were no machines, no planes, only the deafening sound of Hughes' obsession, his unfulfilled dream roaring through the house like a ghostly echo. Suddenly, the room plunged into darkness. Evelyn heard a voice, soft, cold, and distant, whispering her name from the far corner of the room. Evelyn. She spun around, but there was nothing there. The voice grew louder, more insistent. Evelyn, it's not finished. It's not finished. The temperature dropped further, her breath visible in the freezing air. The walls seemed to pulse, throbbing with a malevolent energy. A shadow moved across the far wall, a tall, gaunt figure, unmistakable in its form. Hughes. His apparition appeared at the center of the room, his eyes wide with a feverish intensity, his expression twisted in frustration and fear. He reached toward her, his ghostly hands stretched out, his mouth moving soundlessly as if trying to communicate something desperate, something she couldn't quite grasp. Evelyn's heart raced, and she stumbled backward. Her team now panicked, shouting at her to move. But it was too late. The shadow of Hughes loomed larger, blocking the door, trapping them inside. The air grew thick, suffocating, and the floor beneath their feet began to tremble, as if the house itself were coming to life, responding to Hughes' unfulfilled desires. The team's cameras flickered, and as they recorded, they caught a horrifying sight on the footage. Hughes' reflection was no longer a shadow, no longer a figure trapped in the mirror. It moved, walked toward them, reached for them. The recording showed the ghostly figure coming closer, until its hand was just inches from Evelyn's face. Her scream was caught on camera, but it wasn't just her scream. It was the voice of Hughes, his voice distorted by rage and regret. I will never leave. Not until it's finished. The door slammed shut with a force that rattled the walls, and the sound of a plane engine roared to life once again. The Hacienda, it seemed, was not just haunted by Hughes' spirit, it was possessed by it. His unfinished legacy, his failures and obsessions, had bound him to this place. And now, Evelyn and her team had become part of that legacy, unable to escape the ghost of a man who had built his dreams only to watch them crumble, and who would never let them go. They were trapped, just like all those before them, trapped in the endless cycle of a haunted obsession that could never be finished. Evelyn's scream echoed through the darkened room as the figure of Howard Hughes inched closer, his gaunt form growing more solid with every passing second. His face twisted in frustration, his eyes wide with a desperate need to finish what he had started. The air became suffocating, thick with an oppressive energy that clung to their skin, pressing them into the corners of the room as if the walls themselves were closing in. The sound of a plane's engine roaring to life once again filled their ears, drowning out their frantic thoughts and screams. The team was paralyzed, unable to move as the ghost of Hughes hovered before them, his hands stretching out, pleading silently. The temperature in the room dropped to unbearable levels, and their breath came out in freezing clouds. The world around them seemed to fade as they watched Hughes, his very essence trapped between the living world and the realm beyond. He was no longer just a shadow. He was real, a spectral embodiment of obsession, regret, and unfinished dreams. It's not finished. The voice of Hughes finally broke the silence, harsh and strained, his voice dripping with anguish. I will never leave until it is complete. Evelyn's heart raced as the spirit's eyes locked onto hers. She could feel the pull of his gaze, the weight of his unfulfilled ambition pressing on her chest. It was as if the house itself had become a living, breathing thing, feeding off his madness, his endless quest for perfection. And then, just as Evelyn felt as though she couldn't bear the weight of the spirit any longer, something changed. The floor beneath them trembled violently, and the lights flickered once again. The team screamed in terror as the walls cracked and split, revealing hidden corridors and rooms they had never seen before. A cold wind swept through the house, extinguishing the flames of their torches and leaving them in pitch blackness. The sound of an aircraft's engines grew louder, more intense, as if the very walls were vibrating with the power of the unseen plane taking flight. But there was no plane. It was only the ghostly echo of Hughes' failed creation, trapped in the house, trapped in the mind of a man who couldn't let go. The walls cracked even further, and a low rumble shook the floor, rattling the team to their core. Suddenly, Evelyn felt herself being pulled toward the door, as though some unseen force was dragging her away from the apparition. The air grew heavier with each passing second, and it seemed as though Hughes himself was trying to reach out, to keep her there, to keep them all there forever. But it was too much. Evelyn made a split-second decision, turning on her heel and bolting toward the door, the others following behind her in frantic terror. They reached the entrance just as the room seemed to collapse inward, the house groaning under the strain of its spectral inhabitants. With a final burst of strength, they managed to pry open the door and stumble into the night, gasping for air as they escaped the house. But as they looked back at the hacienda, they saw something that would haunt them forever. In the window of the study, the silhouette of Hughes stood, watching them. His face, twisted with torment, appeared as if frozen in time. His eyes followed them, unblinking, as the house around him trembled and groaned like a dying beast. His ghostly figure remained there, staring at them, even as the last of the storm clouds cleared from the sky. And then, just as quickly as it had appeared, the silhouette was gone. The hacienda stood silent once more. But the terror was not over. The team was never the same after that night. Each of them was plagued by dreams, visions of Hughes' face, his desperate, unrelenting need to finish what he had started. They would hear the faint hum of engines in the distance, the soft click of an old typewriter in the dark, the rustle of blueprints moving in the wind. They tried to move on with their lives, but the hacienda had left its mark on them, leaving them with the undeniable feeling that Howard Hughes was still out there, still trapped in that house, waiting for the moment when his unfinished creation would finally take flight. The hacienda, with all its ghosts and obsessions, would continue to stand at the edge of the desert, a silent testament to the man who could never let go. And those who dared to enter its walls would forever be haunted by the spirit of a genius whose legacy was more than just the sum of his creations. It was a legacy of endless pursuit of perfection, of control, and of a man who could never escape his own obsessions. For Hughes had left something behind when he died. Something more than just his possessions, his fortune, or his airplanes. He had left his spirit, restless and undying, forever trapped within the walls of the hacienda, waiting for someone to finish what he had started. And it was a legacy that would never truly end. Don't forget to subscribe and like if you liked this story.